Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have the Trump administration accidentally texted me its war plans from theatlantic.com, posted by Doctor Who 07, and yeah, it just goes to show you how, a lot of people think government's evil, and I would do agree that, a lot of government people, regardless of which branch of the Unity Party they're in, are evil because they want to enforce their values on you. But regardless, I definitely think they're much more incompetent than evil because why would you add someone from the Atlantic to your private signal group? If you're a Republican government official, you might as well be adding someone from MSNBC or dare I say Reddit itself. Reddit, of course, being one of the biggest progressive circle jerks on the internet, to your signal group. But regardless, I don't think it really matters. Hillary had emails, Hillary had emails on her private server, and the progressives didn't care about that. But now that the outgroup is doing that, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And it just goes to show you how, as I always like to say in this podcast, it's really just who's in the in group, who's in the out group, and not much else actually matters. Then we have FBI launches Tesla threats task force. This is domestic terrorism from CNBC.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should be defending any private company. But, ultimately, the government can justify doing whatever it wants to, and they have the monopoly on force to say so. So ultimately, sometimes you don't you don't get to decide what they can and can't do. It's their decision. And yeah, I personally don't care for all the stuff with the Tesla threats, but I think, I don't think we should have a task force for it. I think, that should just fall under the general threats task force probably. But if you ask me, I think the libertarian positions, we shouldn't have an FBI at all, People should be doing their own investigations rather than a federal government agency. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have exclusive. Louis DeJoy resigns as Postmaster General from Time.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Fed News subreddit. And yeah, I personally didn't really think DeJoy was that good a postmaster, but hopefully this leads to Trump's promise to say he's going to privatize the Postal Service. Personally, I think the Postal Service is extremely ineffective right now. My mail doesn't get here sometimes until 6 or 7 at night, so hopefully I think privatization might make it more effective. Because I know UPS and FedEx are usually more effective than the Postal Service when it comes to getting mail and packages to my house. So hopefully privatization comes, but if it doesn't, I'll cope. So it doesn't really matter too much, I definitely do think, though, privatizing the Postal Service is probably one of the most libertarian things Trump has promised so far during his term. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Glenn Greenwald and Venezuelan immigration violations from Anarcho Federation. That's a YouTube video from Breaking Points. Glenn Greenwald schools Sager on deportation. And yeah, and then they added, I don't always agree with Greenwald, but he makes a convincing case of why this is very problematic as a violation of legal understanding since the 1800s. And I'd agree with that. Personally, I think we need due process for every single person in the U.S., whether they be a citizen or not. But regardless, I do think a lot of people getting deported to places like Venezuela or El Salvador are gang members that deserve it. Not all of them necessarily. I know there was one guy who just had a soccer tattoo, probably wasn't a criminal, but they deported him anyway. But I definitely do think most of them probably are thugs, gang members, and other low-life criminals who probably deserve it. But with that being said, even if they are all of those things, it doesn't mean they're not entitled to due process. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Gabbard claims there was no classified materials that were shared in that signal chat. Senator Warner then shared them, and that's from Ragnar OKXT, and that's a cross post from the Public Freakout subreddit. And yeah, if the government ultimately can classify whatever it wants to, personally, I think we need more transparency, government. We shouldn't have any classified information. The government should all be public access. But, I guess that does kind of kind of undermine their position as a position of authority. But regardless, ultimately, it's their fault they got into this mess in the first place, because you shouldn't be putting someone from the Atlantic in your Signal group, especially since the Atlantic is pretty much, as I said earlier, an MSNBC or Reddit like source. So yeah, I personally think all the group chats should be open and viewable by people, because when you're in government, you need to be held accountable for what you do. But ultimately, if they want to keep it private, I think they should be able to. But they just should remember not to add some numbnuts from the Atlantic next time. Then we have Mike Johnson downplays group chat leaks as officials doing their job, gets torched on X from HuffPost.com by Ragnar OKXG. And of course, HuffPost is just another kind of Atlantic. The progressives aren't going to let this go. It's like, they could have cared less about Hillary's emails, but now that the Out Group has done pretty much the same thing, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. Then we have, as top Trump aide sends text on Signal, flight data show a member of the group chat was in Russia from CBSNews.com, posted by Swampanky Dan. And there's another DNC Reddit troop, Russia. They're always going over. They can't shut up about that country. It's like a lot of people say, oh, the people, all these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Well, it's pretty much like that with the Redditors these days. And so instead of the Jews, it's the Russians who are behind everything. So, if they want to say that, they should be able to. But, eventually, after a decade of going, Russia, Trump and everyone who is ever associated with him is a Russian asset, you get tired of it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have USDA halts delivery of 600,000 pounds of food to Michigan Food Bank from MLive.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. And I definitely would agree that's not a good thing. I think it was probably due to government regulations that shouldn't be there. Otherwise, they'd probably be able to have the food. But regardless, ultimately, the government is always will say it's going to try and help people, but they'll always have regulations that get in the way of them delivering food to a food bank. And that's true even when the Republicans, who are usually seen as being less regulation friendly than the Democrats, are in power. Then we have Texans might soon have to show photo ID to buy a dildo online from 404media.co, posted by LegioX, and that's a cross post from the technology subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think, people should be able to buy whatever they want online regardless of their age. But, I do think it's well intentioned. I don't think 10-year-olds should be buying dildos online, but I don't think that's the government's job, telling people what they can and can't buy. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, has anyone written a good article or book on the hostile takeover that's happened to LP USA? Posted by, looks like they've since deleted their account. And then they added, I'm trying to read some actual good professional coverage of the far-right takeover that's happened, because these libertarians are not the ones I knew growing up. And yeah, ultimately I disagree with the Midas Caucus on some things. I think they're too pro-Trump, but I wouldn't consider them a far-right takeover. But on Reddit, any dissent at all is considered far-right. And eventually, it just kind of starts to lose its appeal when you just constantly say it's like the boy who cried wolf, and it's the Redditor who cried far right, or the Redditor who cried fascist, or the Redditor who cried Russia. Eventually, you just recognize the tropes for what they are, and they just start to lose their impact. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Virginia Governor Youngkin threatens to withhold state funding from alleged sanctuary cities from Fox5DC.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, we can't let localities decide for themselves, you must bend the knee to state and federal officials' whims. And yeah, that's sometimes how governance works. Sometimes people in power are gonna say, oh, we're gonna withhold funding and there's nothing you can do about it. That's very much how the chain of command government works. And yeah, I don't really care for the idea of sanctuary cities, but sometimes, if the government wants to justify not giving you money for being one, then ultimately that's their decision to do so. And yeah, ultimately I do think the localities should decide for themselves, but that doesn't mean they're entitled to funding from higher branches of government, and that's my fault on that issue. Then we have the leaked Signal text from Ragnar OKXG, and that's the leaked text from the Hootie PC small group that leaked on Signal recently, because they stupidly added a member from the Atlantic. I don't even know how stupid you have to be to add a member from the Atlantic, wanted to say at MSNBC as well and Reddit, as I said previously, But yeah, it looks like they're talking. It looks like they said they really didn't care about bailing Europe out again, because that's why they said they're primarily attacking bombing Yemen right now, because they need to open the shipping lanes in the Red Sea for the Europeans so they can get around to Africa. But I don't think that should be the U.S.'s job. I like the point. I like the point that J.D. Vance raised in it. He said he just where was it? It was I think on the third page. He said I'm trying to find it. Yeah, well, regardless, I can't find the exact point by you said, but he did say, I don't want to bail Europe out again. I think that's very much the libertarian understanding of this whole bombing Yemen. The U.S. should be non-interventionist and not bombing countries or funding their militaries like they are in Israel or Ukraine currently. And yeah, but it doesn't really matter which branch of the Union Party is in power. The U.S. is always just going to be, it seems to be, dropping bombs or throwing money away to other countries, because the U.S. is pretty much the world police. And although Redditors say the U.S. shouldn't be the world police anymore, now that Trump is saying that, even though he's not acting on it, they pretty much say, oh, we do need to be the world police. And yeah, personally, I think the U.S. should just be a more introverted nation like it was before the World Wars, and only get involved in disputes that are local to it. But ultimately, the U.S. is gonna justify whatever the government's gonna justify whatever it's doing, and sometimes I can't really decide that for them. Ultimately, I don't think it really matters who's in charge. I think the president and most elected officials are just figureheads. Well, the bureaucrats are the ones who really run the show, and they're always the ones who push for all this interventionism. Then we have Alaskans are too cheap to pay American shipbuilders a proper wage from Spare Simeon, and that's a self-post they made. And they said Alaska wants an exemption to the Jones Act to allow Korean ships to carry LNG between Alaskan ports because American-made ships would cost 5 times as much to build and operate. Why are American ships so expensive? Are the Koreans cutting corners or paying slave wages to their builders and operators? More likely is protectionism, or of course, maybe Trump should tariff all foreign ships to make U.S. ships competitive. And then they link to a Reason.com article, Alaska Post beg for relief from crippling federal shipping restrictions. And yeah, I personally think, if Alaska wants to you do tariffs, I personally don't think that's libertarian. I think, the libertarian position is we shouldn't have tariffs, but I do think, the libertarian position is as well is that since American ships are so expensive, get rid of all the regulations it costs to build them. It might be slightly more dangerous on them sometimes, but, that's the price you pay for efficiency. And yeah, so ultimately, if the government's going to justify it, justifies, but sometimes when there's not enough ships to go around, you gotta ask yourself why that is, and it's often the problem is the government itself and all its burdensome regulations. Then we have new executive order preserving and protecting the integrity of American elections from WhiteHouse.gov, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. That's crosspost from the LOL subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that. I think the states should be running their election rather than the federal government. But regardless, if Joe Biden passed the same executive order and titled it for the fight against voter suppression, Reddit would love it. Because, Reddit, election integrity is what the Republicans say, and voter suppression is what the Democrats say, but they really mean the same thing. The election was rigged against my party, so it doesn't count. And eventually, you just catch on that they're pretty much two sides of the same coin, and maybe they're pretty much on the same side when it comes to actual policy. But they might act like they're always fighting, but it doesn't really matter. It's pretty much just wrestling, I would say, because the script always plays out as they have it, and the people are always going to be fighting each other, even though it doesn't really matter who's in power. The bureaucrats and other deep state actors like the CIA are the ones really running the show. And yeah, I think we're gonna wrap up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.